4. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Gleb. He is an internationally renowned thought leader in emotional and social intelligence, decision-making, and risk management. His specialty is helping forward-looking leaders concerned about resistance to change. He serves as the CEO of the boutique consulting and training company Disaster Avoidance Experts. Its methodology transforms negative emotions and resistance to change into positive emotions and commitment by fusing narratives, nudges, and neuroscience. A best-selling book author of several traditionally published books, Dr. Gleb is most well known for his 2019 book, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, and his 2020 book, The Blind Spots Between Us, How to Overcome Unconscious Cognitive Bias and Build Better Relationships. His groundbreaking thought leadership was featured in over 550 articles and in 450 interviews in prominent venues, including USA Today, Time, Fast Company, CBS News, Fortune, CNBC, Inc. magazine, and many more. His experience comes from over 20 years of consulting, coaching, and training. His clients include innovative startups, major nonprofits, and Fortune 500 companies ranging from Aflac to Xerox. His expertise also comes from his research background as a behavioral scientist with 15 years in academia, including 7 as a professor at Ohio State University. In his free time, he makes sure to spend abundant quality time with his wife to avoid his personal life turning into a disaster. To help you take advantage of his groundbreaking expertise, we've asked him to share with us about defeating unconscious bias via the neuroscience of emotional and social intelligence. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Gleb.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Justin. All right, everyone, welcome. And so let's get into it. Let's talk about how you as architects can successfully defeat unconscious bias. And this is a big topic, an important topic. I'll be going through the presentation. Here's the structure of the presentation so that you can know what the journey will look like. First, we'll talk a little bit about unconscious bias from the neuroscience perspective, what's going on, how our brain works, and specifically, we're giving some examples, some specific dangerous judgment errors that we tend to make. Then we'll talk about the broader framework of unconscious bias and neuroscience. What's actually going on there? What causes our brain to be making these mistakes? And then we'll talk about specific ways of addressing them. We'll talk about 3 techniques. 1, to gain awareness of unconscious bias, both regarding diversity and other sorts of unconscious bias. Then we'll talk about a quick and effective technique on a daily level to address it, and then a broader technique for major serious decisions to address unconscious bias. So that's going to be the nature of the journey that we'll share together. Now, as I started talking, you probably wondered, hey, what's going on here? You know, I look like not one of you just saw my face. I look like a normal, whatever, mainstream white American male, right? But I obviously have an accent. So a lot of folks, immediately their mind jumps to, where am I from? You know, where are you from? That's kind of the question that folks ask. And I'll be happy to tell you. So I'm from a small country called Moldova in Eastern Europe. It's so tiny that it needs an arrow to point to where it is. Very small country. It was liberated from Soviet domination in 1991. And that's what my parents left that country. Fortunately, I was 10 years old, so I had no part in the decision, but I was very glad that they did. You know, I much preferred to live in New York City, where we settled down. So I lived in New York City, then I lived in Boston, got a degree from Harvard. I went to UNC Chapel Hill, where I got my PhD at UNC Chapel Hill. And then I came here to Columbus, Ohio, where I am right now. So go Bucks. That for my job as a professor here. And at the same time, I was doing moonlighting as a professor, doing training, consulting, and coaching. And I went full-time into doing training, consulting, and coaching as the leader of my own company, Disaster Avoidance Experts, as Justin mentioned. That was a few years ago. So it's kind of about my professional journey, my background, how I came from where I was in Moldova to here. Now, the relevant thing about the accent, just so you know, is that in New York City, when I settled down, there was all sorts of people. It's a melting pot. It's just very diverse city. And so it didn't seem weird that I had an accent. Lots of folks around me had accents. And while many immigrants who came to the United States chose to drop their accents, especially people who didn't come to melting pot cities like New York City, I chose to retain my accents. My parents taught me to be proud of my cultural heritage. Unfortunately, when I was living in Chapel Hill, that I realized when I was getting my degree, my PhD, that that was kind of a dumb decision because of what research shows is a phenomenon called accent discrimination. Accent discrimination, it's where people with a foreign accent are perceived as less trustworthy than those who don't have a foreign accent. This applies not only to foreign accents, this applies to regional US accents. Someone from the South might be perceived as not as trustworthy if they go to the North and so on. So the dynamic also plays into things. There's only one foreign accent to which this doesn't apply, and that's the British accent. They still have that cultural imperialism going for them. Now, accent discrimination is part of a broader trend that we have to realize is going on. The decisions that we tend to make in a way that we don't realize, with our guts, with our intuitions, with our hearts, whatever you call it, our feelings instead of our thoughts. And that is the halo effect and the horns effect. The halo effect and the horns effect. The horns effect refers to someone having little horns. That's the name, that's why it's called. When someone has a characteristic that you don't like, because it's not like you, it's different from you. Usually we don't like characteristics of people because they're not like us. They don't share our values, they don't have our accents, they don't have the same appearance that we do, the same ethnicity, the same gender, sexual preferences, ability, all of these sorts of things, value sets, religion, politics. Then we will tend to trust them less. We'll have too negative view of their other characteristics compared to how we should view them, compared to their actual trustworthiness, competence, and so on. And the halo effect, it's like someone has a little halo on their head. That's the opposite, when we like one characteristic. So if you're a Southerner, if you're a Texan, and then you leave Texas and you settle somewhere in Columbus, Ohio, where I am, right? And then you meet another Texan, you will have the same sort of Texan drawl, and you will tend to trust that person more than that person deserves to be trusted, just because you share that background, just because you have that sense of connection. And that applies to all sorts of these other qualities, whether you're religion, politics, value sets, and so on. And this is especially dangerous, harmful for business relationships. So I'll give you an example. So I'm here in Columbus, Ohio. And if you know anything about Columbus, Ohio, you'll know it's the home of the Ohio State Buckeyes. They're one of the best football teams in the country, and looks like we're going to the playoffs. So that's great this year, despite COVID, all the problems surrounding that. And unfortunately, our big game with the University of Michigan Wolverines was canceled. So the league bent the rules for us a little bit because the University of Michigan players got COVID, so they canceled it off. So we won't have a chance to beat them this year, unfortunately. And the University of Michigan Wolverines rivalry with the Ohio State Buckeyes is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, rivalries in college football. So I was giving a presentation here in 2018, closing keynote of the HR conference here in Columbus, Ohio, for regional HR leaders in diversity and inclusion. So it's diversity and inclusion conference, over 100 people in the audience, top leaders in HR, and who are focusing on diversity and inclusion. And I asked them, hey, how many of you here would hire a Wolverines fan? How many would hire a Wolverines fan? And you know what? Of all the over 100 people there, only 3 of them raised their hands. Only 3 people would hire a Wolverines fan. And of course, being a fan of Wolverines doesn't indicate anything about your competence for the job, right? But it would be a disqualifying factor for over 97% of the people in the room. And that's an example of where a sense of, are you on my team? Are you not on my team? Are you part of my tribe or are you not part of my tribe? Causes a lot of dangerous problems, a lot of harmful issues. And of course, that sort of tribalism and teamwork doesn't only apply externally to hiring and promotion, business relationships, client development. It applies to all of that sort of stuff, but applies within companies as well. So if you have different departments within a company, for example, if you have operations and sales, an architectural firm, the different parts of an architectural firm might have internal collaboration with each other. So teams within an architectural firm competing with other teams in an architectural firm, other departments, other sections of the architectural firm. And that's actually something that was shared with me when I was doing a presentation, much like this one, for a chapter of the American Architects Association, the AIA in Florida Southwest. So I was doing a presentation on this, and I was told that, hey, within our architectural firm, we have internal teams having good teamwork together, but competing with other teams in the firm, and that causes a lot of problems. So you have internal halo effects on your own team within the architectural firm, but horns effects toward others, other teams, other cliques in the architectural firm that cause a lot of problems, cause a lot of damage in the architectural firm as well. And that's separately from the issue of individual people being evaluated more positively and more negatively, more positively than they deserve or more negatively than they deserve, the halo effect or the horns effect, just because of their backgrounds and characteristics. So I want you to take 30 seconds right now and write down where in your context, in your workplace, might the halo effect and the horns effect be playing a role. So just take 30 seconds to write that down. Where might they be playing a role? All right, and now we'll do a poll on this topic. So this is a Zoom poll. When you look at Zoom, you'll be able to vote on the poll right now. So in your workplace, the question is, how problematic is the halo and horns effect? If it's not at all or a minor problem, a moderate problem, or a large problem. So again, minor problem, not at all a problem, a moderate problem, or a large problem. Please go ahead. So I see we have 80% of the people voting. Good, I'll give you 5 more seconds for those who didn't vote yet to make your voice heard. Great, so we see it's not at all or a minor problem for 60% of you, but for 40% of you, it's a moderate problem. And that's good for you to be aware of. I'm glad that it's not a problem for some of you, but for many others, it's of course a problem. So you need to think about where it's a problem, like we talked about, and take next steps to address it. Good. Good to be aware of these. Now, let's figure out what's going on here with the halo effect, the horns effect. What do we need to understand about them? What's the broader framework? The broader framework has to do with emotional intelligence and social intelligence. Emotional intelligence and social intelligence. Emotional intelligence refers to basically being aware of ourselves. It's about ourselves. So emotional intelligence refers to the awareness of our emotions. And it's incredibly important to understand this because our emotions drive our decisions and behavior. Our decisions, no matter how rational we might think of ourselves, are actually fundamentally emotional when you look at the research on this topic. About 80 to 90% of our decisions comes from our emotions. So emotional intelligence refers to being aware of and being able to manage your emotions. So 2 components, awareness and management. And then social intelligence has to do with others. Again, other people are making their decisions because of their emotions. Your clients and your architectural firms are making their decisions because of their emotions primarily, no matter how rational it may seem. And of course, so your business collaborators, other architects, it's fundamentally emotional. So you need to have awareness and ability to manage other people's emotions and their relationships to each other and to you. That's emotional intelligence and social intelligence. Emotional intelligence is important for you not to fall into these dangerous judgment errors, like the halo effect and the horns effect. Social intelligence is important for you to address dangerous judgment errors in other people. So that's kind of the breakdown that you want to be thinking about. The emotional intelligence, that's about you, awareness and management. Social intelligence, that's about others, influence, awareness and management. The reason I talk about our gut, our emotions, not being a good guide is that, well, one of the reasons I talk about it is because it's so bad. You get so much bad advice about this from top gurus, Tony Robbins, who tells us to be primal, be savage, or Malcolm Gladwell, who wrote the book Blink and says, make your decision in the blink of an eye. Tell you to go with your gut, trust your intuition, follow your heart. And you know what? It feels good to us. It feels comfortable to us to follow our heart. That, by definition, it fits our intuitions. It's what feels good. When we feel something is true, then we believe it's true and we act upon it as if it's true, regardless of whether it's true or not. When we feel something is right, a certain course of action, a certain decision, then we act on it. Then we believe it's right, and then we act on it, regardless of whether it's right, regardless of whether hiring someone who is a Wolverines fan is the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. All of these sorts of things, the halo effect and the horns effect, influence us because we trust our gut too much. We focus too much on our emotions, and that leads to disasters pretty frequently in our relationships to each other. And that's what unconscious bias is all about. These disasters that come from following our gut, going with our emotions, as opposed to evaluating things more rationally. Our gut essentially is a bad guide because it's evolved for the ancient savannah. It's not the modern world. I mean, think about the modern world with the internet and so on. That's only been around since 1990, right? We have not had time to evolve for it. Our gut reactions, our intuitions, our emotions are actually adapted for the savannah environment. When we lived in small tribes of 15 people to 150 people, we were hunters, gatherers, and foragers. It was very important for us in that environment to be very tribal. If we weren't sufficiently tribal, we'd be kicked out of our tribe and we'd die. So we had to have a very strong halo effect toward others in our tribe. And we had to have a very strong horns effect toward those who are not from our tribe, because people who are not from our tribe would, if we didn't oppose them sufficiently, they'd conquer our tribe and take its territory, and we'd die as well. You notice we're the descendants of those who didn't die. So that's something to understand. That's where the tribalism dynamic comes from. Halo and horns effect are two aspects, two specific ways that tribalism manifests itself in the modern world. And there are certainly other ways that it manifests itself in the modern world as well. The specific ways that our mistakes manifest in the modern world, unconscious bias and so on, are called cognitive biases. So cognitive biases is the technical name for all of these dangerous judgment errors. If you want to look at the list of cognitive biases in Wikipedia, you'll see that there's over 100 of them. So a list of over 100 cognitive biases. Far from all of them will be relevant to professional settings. So you'll get, as part of the resources, I'll email it to you after the presentation, some information on these cognitive biases, the 30 most dangerous ones in professional settings. You'll get a book, you'll get an assessment, and we'll go through the assessment as part of the presentation that you can use to assess what's going on in your workplace regarding these cognitive biases. They come from a combination of our evolutionary background and how our brains are wired. That's how these cognitive biases come from. So that's what you need to understand about cognitive biases. That's what they are. Now, I want to ask you, going back to polling, so I'll take a look at another poll. I want to ask you about mistakes. When have you ever had a time when you were very confident that you're right about something and you turned out to be wrong, maybe badly wrong? And this led you to have some doubt about other areas of your life. I mean, I know it happened to me when I hired an assistant manager for my company, Disaster Avoidance Experts. I promoted somebody from the ranks and I thought that they would be a good fit, and they seemed like they would be a good fit, but they turned out to be very micromanagey, not really doing well with transforming their relationships from their former team members equals to being kind of a director, a boss. That was not a good dynamic, and had to let that person go. That was a bad mistake on my part, and it really shook my confidence in my ability to manage my team. So I want to ask you, and that's an example, of course, whether there was ever a time when you felt very confident, but you turned out to be wrong, and that led you to doubt your other decisions. So please go ahead and vote. See, 2/3 of you voted, so let's get a few more. Please go ahead, vote if you haven't yet. Okay, I'll give you 3 more seconds to vote. So people are maybe shy. All right, end polling. Well, we see that this happened to everyone. So this is an experience that everyone shares here. So it's good to know, it's good for you to realize that this is a very common experience. And that is the experience of falling into a cognitive bias. When you're feeling very confident, you turn out to be badly wrong, and that leads you to doubt other areas. So that is the experience of falling into one of these cognitive biases. Now, how do we overcome these cognitive biases? So we talked about what they are. We talked about what's going on there. How do we overcome these dangerous judgment errors? We need to understand that you need to go against your intuitions. It feels very counterintuitive and uncomfortable by definition to go against your intuitions. But that's what you need to do to go against these cognitive biases and correct these specific dangerous judgment errors that harm us, seriously harm us in the modern world. Our intuitions are great for those environments where the early humans needed to survive. That tribalism is fundamentally important for them. So that's great for those environments, but not great for the modern world. We live in complex organizations. I mean, architectural firms have to survive in a modern complex world, right? It's not you're not just with members of your own tribe, you're with people who are very different from you. And that's simply inside the architectural firm. You need to collaborate with all sorts of folks, clients, vendors, all sorts of subcontractors who are going to be very different than you. And you need to know how to do that effectively. And tribalism does not help us in the modern world where it's global, interconnected, multipolar. So you need to understand that tribalism, again, there's only one aspect of these dangerous judgment errors, is harmful. And that's the unconscious bias, kind of what it typically talks about. And we already learned in some areas of our lives how to overcome these sorts of things, how to notice and overcome them. For example, in our physical fitness, specifically, let's talk about eating. When there's, let's say you come into the break room and a grateful vendor sent you a box of donuts for the holidays, and it's standing there, kind of dozen donuts opened up, and your office manager put it in there for everyone. And it's very tempting to take that chocolate glazed donut. It looks very delicious. Looking at you, it's tempting you. Maybe you decide to take half a donut. Well, you take half a donut and there's kind of that half staring at you and you're like, well, I don't want to leave half a donut for other people. Let me just take the other half. And then you're kind of triggered by the sugar. So you take another one and then a third one. And before you know it, half the box is gone. Not that it ever happened to me. This is a common experience for us. Perhaps not half a box, but certainly more than you would like to have. That is because we're triggered by sugar. So sugar is something that's very triggering, and we have a great deal of processed sugar in the modern environment. The savanna environment, when you came across a source of sugar, when our ancestors came across a source of sugar, like honey or sugarcane or something like that, it was really important to have as much of it as possible for them to survive and thrive. With the descendants of those who were able to have a ton of sugar, and then they were able to survive, thrive, and reproduce, and that's how they had us. In the modern environment, it's a bad idea. We're battling with a serious obesity epidemic here in the United States because of people giving in to the impulse to be triggered by sugar. Instead, it's much healthier to do something like pass by those donuts and go for the bowl of fruit that another vendor sent you. And so that's a much healthier option. And that's just one way, a specific tactic of addressing the dangerous judgment errors that have to do with our eating. And again, that's something that you learned how to do already, hopefully, to address the obesity epidemic, the problems in the modern world that come from eating excessive sugar. And in the same way, you have to learn yourself and you have to teach others in your firms who you're collaborating with to not fall into these dangerous judgment errors. So you already learned it in your physical fitness. Now you need to apply it to mental fitness. So that's kind of where you want to be using these techniques to address these dangerous judgment errors and where you already do some of that in your life. Now, let's talk about the assessment dimension. It focuses on the 30, and that's one of the 3 specific techniques that I'll talk about to address these dangerous judgment errors. It focuses on the 30 most dangerous cognitive biases in professional settings. It evaluates their extent and their impact on your workplace and provides you with the next steps for addressing them. It's a great tool to take yourself and see what your perspective is. And again, it's not about being 100% objective. That's not what it's about. It's about trying to uncover what might be problems in your organization, what might be going on in your workplace. And it's a great tool for you to take and then to bring to your team and have your team take and discuss it together. This is what it's about. It's about surfacing problems. So you want to make sure that when you answer a question, you can answer a question in a number of ways and frame it well. It could be, minimize things, but you don't want to minimize things. You want to get at real problems. So give an honest, authentic answer. If you can give an answer that gives a higher extent of the problems, you want to give that answer in order to be able to deal with the problems effectively. So the more you can see a problem, if you can see from a certain framing a problem occurring, you want to indicate that it is occurring. All right, I will share my screen now, and I will want you to bring up the chat. We will be using the chat function to engage with the assessment. So you should all be able to see the assessment on my screen right now. So it's the assessment. Let me go down to the directions. So each of these questions refers to a specific problem that occurs in your workplace, everyday professional settings, and you want to indicate how often it occurred in the past year. The answer will be in percentage terms out of all the times it could have occurred. If you're doing the assessment with this, you can do it a specific focus on your team in the architectural firm, depending on how it's organized. You can do it on the whole architectural firm. You can do it on whatever organization that you're working on. And so that's what you want to be thinking about. You can do right now, just do it for the whole architectural firm, but you can apply it more narrowly if you choose to do so. You don't want to overthink it. Your initial impression will likely be correct. So each question should take you 10 to 15 seconds to do. So let's start with question 6. When a potential or current employee was evaluated, in what percentage of the situations was the evaluation too positive due to factors not relevant to their job competency or organizational fit? So please type your answer in the chat. So this is number 1. What percentage of the time was the evaluation done in a too positive a manner, in a way that didn't fit the organizational fit? So please use the chat function. So we see Justin, 10%, other folks, 10 to 15%, 20%, 10%, 20%, 5%, 15%, 15%. Okay, so we see that it's kind of in the 5, 10, 15, 20% range. If it's in the 5 to 10% range, that's not okay. That's not too bad. That's kind of within the acceptable range. But if you're getting above the 10% range, 10%, 15, 20, that's becoming more of a serious issue, kind of, and that causes resentment, that causes tensions, that causes struggles. So that's an example, of course, of the halo effect that you want to make sure to address the halo effect in your organization. So when you're getting into the 10% and above, that becomes more of a problem, and that's kind of in the moderate problem range. If it's in the 20% and higher than that, it becomes more of a serious problem. Now let's talk about another one. Of all situations when someone had evidence that would contradict their beliefs or clear information that would say that their interpretation of the situation is wrong, in what percentage of cases did they ignore the evidence or misinterpret the information? Maybe about what a client wants for a project, or whether a client would actually be going forward, or tensions within the firm, or whatever it is, government regulations, anything where people really should know better, and then they make a bad decision. So please go ahead for number 2. Chat your answer. 15%, 5%. My 5%, 5%. Goodness. Good to see that. Other folks, what's your percent? 5%. Good. So this seems to be not too common. Less, so 20%, 10%. So this seems to be slightly less problematic than the halo effect. This is called the confirmation bias, where we tend to look for information that confirms our beliefs and ignore information that doesn't. So that's important for you to understand. That's the dynamic that's going on with the assessment. And if you're in the 5 to 10% range, not too bad. If you're getting into above 10%, that becomes more of a serious issue. Let's talk about team conflicts. And this, again, is something that's important to understand with this dangerous judgment error. What percentage of team conflicts occurred because someone overestimated the effectiveness of their communication skills and persuasiveness? Now, team conflicts occur in any organization, so maybe over the last year, 50 team conflicts, right? What percentage of them occurred because someone overestimated how effective they are in communicating and persuading others? So out of all team conflicts, they occurred because of this reason. Please go ahead, check your answers. 10%, 20%, 20 to 25%, 25%, 25%, 25%, 25%, 30%. Good. So it's good to understand that. So this is clearly a somewhat more of a serious issue than the other two. This refers to the illusion of transparency. When we feel that when we are communicating that we are inherently effective communicators. That's just how it feels. We feel that we're getting across 100% of our message to the other person. Unfortunately, that's not the case. First of all, in the modern world of the pandemic and Zoom, there can be always technical glitches and malfunctions where the other person doesn't get certain things. Then, of course, we can't see the other person's body language nearly as well as we would when we're actually engaging with them in person. So we're missing a lot of things. The other person is missing a lot of things about our body language, about what we're trying to communicate. So that's one issue. In face-to-face, the person, of course, might mishear something, or they might have different definitions of common terms, that's some jargony terms especially. And architects sometimes have a problem with that, communicating to others in jargony terms. And of course, there's always the issue of distraction. The other person might be thinking about an important meeting that they're having in an hour, or what they're going to eat for dinner, and they might be distracted. And of course, they can also be interpreting what you're telling them in their framing, through their light. So that might cause them to have problems interpreting what you're saying as well. Good. And the last one that I'll do, just to give you an example, what percentage of projects missed the deadline or went over budget in your company in the last year? So what percentage out of all projects, ones that missed the deadline or went over budget? So please go ahead, check your answer. Missed deadline, went over budget. 5%. Go ahead. Missed the deadline, went over budget. 5%, 10%, 5%, 10%. 5. Okay, so this seems to be much less of a problem, 15%. So this seems to be less of a problem than the previous one, not 25%. So this, for a couple of folks, this is more of a problem. So please go ahead, still check your answers. This refers to a dangerous judgment error called the planning fallacy. The planning fallacy. So when we make plans, we tend to feel that everything will go according to plan. That's how it is. That's just our gut reactions. Unfortunately, things often don't go according to plan. And so people feel like they made a plan. You've probably heard the phrase, failing to plan is planning to fail. Failing to plan is planning to fail. That gives a false sense of comfort, because then when we make a plan, we feel that everything will go according to plan. Instead, what I strongly recommend folks to do is have the phrase failing to plan for problems is planning to fail. So again, failing to plan for problems is planning to fail is a much more effective phrase that gets you in the right mindset of addressing risks and problems. All right, great. Let's take a look at the poll. So next poll will be about the assessment. How helpful might it be for your team to take the assessment on dangerous judgment errors in the workplace? Not helpful, moderately helpful, or very helpful. Please go ahead and vote. How helpful might it be? See, about 25% of the people voted, so let's get a few more. Okay, Matthew, I think, can't vote for some reason, but he would vote C, very helpful. Great. Give you 3 more seconds to vote. And Lindsay says very helpful. That's very, very, very helpful. Okay, thank you. Share results. Okay, great. So you see that for 95% of you, it would be helpful, either moderately helpful or very helpful. And for one of you, it would be very, very, very helpful. So for those folks who would find it moderately helpful, what you want to do is, I'll send it to you after the presentation. You'll want to take the assessment, go through it yourself. There's the next section that goes through, that we didn't touch on here, that looks at the impact of these dangerous judgment errors. You score your organization, then you look at the impact, and then the next steps for addressing them. And then you want to bring that information to your team and say, hey, I took this. I think it might be helpful for us to take it. Let's talk about it. Let's discuss it and explore it. If you find it very helpful, you definitely want to take it yourself, for that quarter of you who find it very helpful. But, and I guess more because Matthew, I think, couldn't vote for some reason. So you want to not simply take it yourself, but then just email it out to your team right away and say, I think we should do this. Please, take a look at it yourself. Let's go through it, and let's all take it. So make it more of a priority, make it more of a strong statement that this is something you want to go through. All right. Let's talk about the next technique. This is a technique to make quick decisions that addresses unconscious bias and other dangerous judgment errors at once. So if you want to make a decision, this is a technique to make decisions. You can make it quickly, you can make it take a long time for more serious decisions, but the essence of this technique is that it avoids decision disasters. It gets you a good enough decision, which in the large majority of cases is going to be good enough. So when you want a good enough decision, you don't want a perfect decision, just want a good enough decision. This is the technique you want to use. First, what important information didn't I yet fully consider? So these 5 questions. What evidence then should take into account? The confirmation bias causes us to look for evidence that confirms our beliefs rather than evidence that it causes us to ignore our beliefs. So let's say if we are looking for evidence that says that, hey, the client will do what I want the client to do, we might ignore information the client won't. Or let's say that we're looking for information, we can do the same thing when we're looking at progressing in our architectural firm and kind of improving our career, saying that, yes, I'm doing great, and ignoring information that some of the partners are not too happy with you. So some of those sorts of things. Then, what dangerous judgment errors didn't I yet fully address? So what evidence didn't you take into account? Once you go through the assessment and go through it a couple of times, and I'll send you the book, you'll go through it, you'll quickly learn what the dangerous judgment errors are about any situation. If you're making a project, the planning fallacy, if you're communicating with a team, the illusion of transparency, if you're evaluating someone, hail and horns effect. What would a trusted and objective advisor suggest to you? So what would that angel on your shoulder suggest you do? Maybe another member of the board of AIA Fort Worth, or somebody else who you trust, who is a credible, trusted advisor. You get about 50% of the benefit by just thinking about what this person would do in this situation. And you get the other 50% of the benefit, of course, if this is a more serious matter, by giving this person a call. Next, how have I addressed all the ways this decision can fail? Think about, let's say you're writing an important email to a client, trying to persuade your client to do something that maybe the client doesn't really want to do, but you know it and the client should know it, and kind of rationally, logically, maybe their emotions are impeding them. How have you addressed all the ways this email could fail? Well, maybe the client could feel defensive when they receive the email, or they could feel like you're pressuring them. Maybe you want to take a day, read a draft and sleep on it, and read it over the next day after you write it, of course, and see if you can make the email, you can decrease any aspects of defensiveness and the email might trigger, or sense of pressure the client would get. I had to write an email like that this morning when my client, a coaching client for my firm, has a deliverable that she has to create a narrative of vision. So we're working on a change management project in her team where she wants to make her team more unified, remove some of the divisions. And one of the issues that needs to happen for any change management project, we can talk about this later, is you need to have a clear vision of the future. And she didn't have that when she started this. So she brought me in after she started the change management project when she was facing some resistance to change. And so one of the tasks that I asked her to do was to write out a narrative, a vision, a clear vision with all aspects of the change that you want to see, how the company will be different 3 years from now, what it will look like. And she's a little bit delayed in getting that, so I have to kind of encourage her to get the deliverable to me so that we can collaborate and move forward together, but at the same time, not feel like I'm pressuring her. She's a client, right? So that's something, and not cause her to feel defensive because she's not doing the work that she really needs to do, can't do it for her. Next, what new information caused me to revisit this decision? What would cause you to change your mind about the decision? There are a number of things that you can do to get this. So for example, if you're entering a collaboration with a new vendor, you can have instead of doing the waterfall approach and doing like a whole large project with a vendor at once, you can do a small project. You can test out how are you doing, what your relationship with that vendor will be, and whether they would be as responsive and as appropriate for your needs as you think they would be. So that's kind of new information that could cause you to change your mind. Or the same thing about a client, if my client doesn't respond within a couple of days, I've sent a specific revision point to give the client a call. So that's a very specific revision point that's very clear. I know it's going to happen. So that's a way that you can use this technique as well. All right, so the 5 questions technique, you can use it for minor daily decisions, like let's say writing an important email to a client. I mean, I do this, these are daily decisions that anyone in a leadership position like me has to make 5 to 10 times a day. Or of course, for major serious decisions that you don't want to screw up, like how to work with a major new vendor or client, something like that. Polling. Let's take a look at the poll. How helpful might it be for your team to use this technique for daily decisions? For your team to use this for daily decisions? Not helpful, moderately helpful, or very helpful? Please go ahead and vote. See about just over half of you voted. Let's get the other half voting. Give you 3 more seconds to make your voice heard. 3 more seconds. Okay, great. So we found everyone would find it helpful. That's great to hear. So about half of you, just over half of you would find it moderately helpful. Just under half of you would find it very helpful. So again, kind of the same dynamic. What you want to do if you're finding it moderately helpful is to definitely start using it yourself. I'll send you a decision aid that you can print out, have it by your computer, and then send it out to your team and have a discussion about, hey, Matthew, no worries. I hope you enjoyed the presentation so far. So he has to leave. So again, talk to them, say, hey, what do you think you would find it? Might this be something that we can discuss? Talk to the leadership of your firm about it. For those who would find it very helpful, that's something to make much more straightforward, saying, I think that would be very helpful if we start using this. Here's decision aid. Let's all start using this for our daily decisions that we don't want to screw up for. Good enough decisions. This is especially good when you're thinking about team decisions, to make sure that everyone, before a decision-making meeting, everyone comes and everyone answers the same 5 questions for themselves before coming to the meeting. And then you structure the agenda of the meeting along these 5 questions. Then that becomes much easier for you to run the meeting effectively, and you just go through the agenda. My clients typically say about 60% of their time, because they're not meandering on various issues that don't really have too much place in the decision, and they're really focusing on the important parts of the decision, and they can be really confident about the process, that they're going for the right process. Now, I will also share with you a technique that you can use to make the best decisions. This technique is when you have a number of options and you need to pick among the options to make sure that you pick the best option. So this is the technique that you'll use. This takes over an hour. The previous technique for daily decisions that can take only a couple of minutes if the decision is right. If it's not right, you definitely want to take more time. This is the technique when you're making a major decision and when you want to make the perfect decision. You don't simply want a good enough decision. So let's say when you're making a major hire, or you're deciding on a major project, something like that, deciding on a let's say merger or an acquisition or something like that, deciding on something that's really serious. This is the technique that you'll use when you want to have a number of options. When you're, let's say, you're looking for a vendor on a very important project and you are looking at 5 vendors. That's what you want to be using this technique, when you want to select the perfect option as opposed to just a good enough option. First of all, identify the need for decision-making process. It can be hard to do when there's no explicit problem. Like, let's say you're not having a good relationship with someone in the company, and maybe it would be good to let them go, or really have a serious conversation, but it's uncomfortable to do so. Or you want to change the direction of a company, pivot, but there's no explicit need to do so. It might be uncomfortable to accept the need to make a tough decision. You want to recognize the need before it becomes an emergency. Next, gather information from diverse perspectives. You want to talk to different people, not people like yourself. That's especially important. Place a higher value on people with whose opinions you disagree, especially with those toward whom you might have some horns effect, but who are still pretty smart. Such perspectives, they help you recognize those bias blind spots that we all have. I have those, so that definitely happens to me. Set specific and clear goals. You want a clear vision of the desired outcome. The challenge with the client that I was mentioning, that she started the transformation project, the change management project, without having clear vision of the desired outcome. It caused a lot of confusion. She is much more of a visionary person, so not having that, so she has kind of that sense that this is what it should be. But many other people, they want a very clear, specific vision of what it will look like and how you will get there. So that is something that was a problem for the client, and before she brought me in, and right now that's something we're working on. So you definitely want to have this vision of a clear outcome, a couple of years from the decision, what you want to achieve. Especially important to recognize when a seemingly one-time decision is actually a symptom of an underlying issue. So you want to get at the root cause. The root cause, you want to address that as part of the desired outcome. Then develop clear decision-making criteria. So develop the criteria for a vendor that you choose, or a hire that you're making, or a certain direction that you're deciding to take your company in. If you're, let's say, deciding to shift toward working more with government projects, that's a big decision, major decision, and that's something that you really want to have clear criteria about whether it's worth it or not. There's a lot of government hassle regulation, but it might well be worth it. You'll need to use these to weigh the options that you choose, and you want to rank each criterion on a scale of 1 low to 10 high. Then generate viable options. So there are at least, you want to go for at least 5 viable options. This is a major failing. Leaders tend to often want to make a decision quickly, even though in this case, you don't want to make a decision quickly. You really want to make the best decision that will be worth it in the long run. Generate at least 5 viable options to make the best decision. Then evaluate these options and pick the best of the bunch. Rank each option, each criteria. So let's say you're making a major hire. You want to rank somebody on salary. You want to rank somebody on how much diversity they bring to the organization. You want to rank somebody on the kind of contacts they have in the organization, broadly, that they can bring to the organization's reputation, and so on. Multiply the ranks you assign by the criterion, by the weight of it. So you'll get a weighted average. I can talk more about that later. And that you'll get a numerical score. You want to beware of going with your initial preference. It's very tempting to do so. So you want to look at your initial preferences in a harsher light. Then implement the option you choose. This is really important. You can make a great decision choice, but if you don't implement it well, then you'll kind of screw up. That's kind of useless. There are 2 parts here. Imagine it failed, the decision completely failed, and imagine the decision absolutely succeeded. For the first part, you want to give yourself permission to imagine that it failed. The hire failed, the new direction for your company failed, the working with a new vendor failed. Why might it have failed? Brainstorm all the reasons for failure. And here's the payoff. You want to consider how you can solve these reasons, and then integrate these solutions into your implementation plan. So you want to solve these problems in advance before they occur. So address these problems. And the opposite for success. Imagine it absolutely succeeded. Brainstorm all the reasons for why it succeeded. Why did it succeed? And how can you bring these reasons into life? And then integrate these into the implementation plan. And finally, the last step of these 8 steps, you want to evaluate the implementation. So you don't want to simply say, here's the plan. You want, as you go through it, evaluate what's going on. You want clear metrics of success. What does it mean to succeed with working with this new vendor? What does it mean to succeed in going in this new direction with your firm? What does it mean for the new hire to succeed? And check in regularly to make sure that you're meeting or ideally exceeding these metrics. And you want to revise the implementation if you need to, if you're not meeting those metrics, including revising the original decision. So this 8-step process for making the best possible decisions on when you need to make the perfect decision here. How helpful might it be for your team to use this for major decisions, for those decisions that you not simply don't want to screw up, but you want to make the perfect decision? Please go ahead and vote. How helpful might it be? Go ahead. So I see 1/3 of the people voted. About 2/3 voted. Let's give the rest. I'll give you 3 more seconds to vote. If you didn't vote yet, make your voice heard. Great. So we see that everyone would find helpful. That's excellent. So you about just over 2/3 of you would find moderately helpful, and just over 1/4 of you would find very helpful. Excellent. I'm glad that you would find either moderately helpful or very helpful. The same dynamic applies. So if you find moderately helpful, definitely use it yourself when you're making major decisions. And you want to email this out, information out. I'll send you a manual with this technique, so you'll be able to take a look at it and use it. Send out the manual, say, hey, here's the technique I learned, here's why I think it might be helpful. Let's discuss it, see if it would be helpful. If you find it very helpful, you definitely want to push it out and make a strong statement. I think it will be very helpful. And here's the reasons why I think it will be very helpful for us to use it now on. So let's go through it. There was a study in 2002 that found that of all major projects, about 80 of all major construction projects, about 86% went over time or over budget. So that's the time. This is the time you want to make sure to use this technique to make the best decision about these major projects, and you don't want to screw those up. All right, great. And so I mentioned the resources that I'll send, just so you know that this is after the presentation. I'll send an email. Ignore the tiny URL that I'll just send the resources to you. A free coaching session with me, decision 8 and 5 key questions to avoid decision disasters, manual on the technique for making the best decisions. So this is what you'll get after the presentation. And now I will be happy to take any questions that you have about any aspects of the presentation. You can unmute yourself, or a relatively small group, or you can type them into the chat if you're kind of in a busy environment but just don't want to unmute yourself. Go ahead. Happy to take your questions.
I know you said that you wanted 5 different options to consider,
yes.
When making decisions. Do you see a time where 5 is just excessive, like depending on the specificity of what's being considered? I can understand in hiring where 5 good options might be available, but if you try to apply that concept to a larger scenario where you have an issue with a client and we need to come up with a solution, 5 might be excessive.
Yes, so when you're looking at issues with the client and coming up with a solution, it feels like it would be excessive. If you can get to 5 options, that would be great, because you will make the best option. But of course, 5 is what the research, so I'm telling you what the research suggests, right? So when you're looking at the research, when you have under 5 options, then you will tend not to make the best decision. If you're getting to 5 options or above, then you will make the best decision. You don't need more than 5, really. But when you get to 5 is when you tend to make the best decision. And so that's kind of the dynamic. If you think about the curve of where you make the best decisions. And that doesn't mean that it applies in every situation, of course. If you're deciding on a major strategic shift for your company, that you might only have 2 free options, or a client scenario. It just depends on each situation. But if you can get to 5 options, you certainly should. You don't need to go for more than 5 viable options. Does that help, Lindsay?
Yes, thank you.
You're very welcome. Other folks, chat or unmute yourself.
Was muted. Is there anything particular that you find, if you've worked with a lot of groups of architects before, or any groups, that we are particularly biased in the way that we make decisions, or don't consider all the best options that are unique to what we do and the way that we relate to the clients that we have? Anything that you've noticed?
Yes. What I've noticed is that architects tend to perceive themselves as very analytical, and they tend to strongly ignore emotions. The emotions of other architects who they collaborate with, and especially the emotions of clients. So they tend to think that, well, this is the logical, rational solution, and this is the way that we should proceed. And they don't think about how influential emotions are in actually shaping their decisions, the client's decisions, what they are feeling, what the clients are feeling. They're not exactly, architects tend to have a problem with both emotional intelligence and social intelligence. So that's what I have seen as the biggest problems for groups of architects. And that's what I tend to work with them most on. The same thing for change management within an architectural firm. So when I work with the architectural firm on change management, there tends to be a strong underestimation of the emotions that impede change management. When you want to make a change, a serious shift in your systems, processes, the change is fundamentally about emotions. You might have very logical, reasonable reasons for making the change, but the blocks to it, the resistance, will come from an emotional place, and architects don't tend to consider the emotions nearly as much as they should. So that's what I've seen as the biggest problems, internally and externally.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Other folks? Give another 5 seconds in case anybody still has a waiting question. All right, Justin, it's all yours. Please close us out.
I will speak on behalf of everybody, but I really appreciate you doing this for us, for our group. I feel it was very beneficial. And again, thanks to everybody that attended and your attention during the presentation. And Dr. Gleb, thank you again. And look forward to seeing those resources. And I would assume with those resources, we'll have your email to where if anybody needs to ask questions or anything like that afterwards, they're able to.
Absolutely. Yeah, especially both, including those who hopped off the call, and if you have, busy right now, questions develop later. Absolutely. All right, everyone. You have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye all.